Hello, so today I'm going to be doing a book review on Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. I think that this was a fantastic book. It was very controversial. I mean, from the title, you can tell that it's going to be a controversial book. This book was recommended by quite a few people, but especially by Giles Steinberg. He's the one that really got me to commit to purchasing this and reading it as my first book of 2023. It's the first book that I have completed this year thus far. And I had really no expectations going into this book, as in I knew it was going to be about in regards to race, but if I could give kind of a summary of my thoughts, it would be that yes, there are controversial topics that I do agree with him on, but then there are several things that I would say that I don't necessarily agree with him on. On a scale from 1 to 10, I would give this book an 8.5 because it does challenge a lot of narratives that we're used to, especially in the United States, considering race relations in this country today. So I kind of wanted to break it down by chapter. So I'm starting with the first chapter, which was titled Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And I do have notes here that I'm going to be referencing because I did go through and highlight parts that were kind of important to me or significant to me that I wanted to reference, when I talked about the book or discussed the book with other people. And I have those highlighted, but I also made notes to reference during this review. So the first chapter, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, I thought that was basically what I'd been thinking many years prior to even reading this book. So in this chapter, he kind of discusses how poor white immigrants came to the South, and America, that is, came to the South, and they had a certain culture that was not celebrated by Northern whites. And in that culture, they were known to be violent, uneducated, and irresponsible. So that is something that he states that Black Americans in this country assimilated and made their own culture because we were most slaves back then in the South. So that makes sense. I think that he makes a very good point in that, white Southern culture was not celebrated at the time by Northern whites. But now it's not really celebrated even if you think about it now. But when you think about Black American culture, which more or less mimics white Southern culture, it is celebrated because I feel like, and I think he stated this in the book too, that there's this identity within culture where there shouldn't be. There's one thing in criticizing someone in something that they cannot control, such as their race or their height or their hair color. Those are things that you cannot control. But criticizing someone over things that they can control, such as their behavior, their attitudes, their culture, you can choose what you do and do not do. So I found that there's a double standard there when it comes to essentially the same culture, but exhibited by two different races. So I completely agree with him in the fact that it should be criticized, it should be questioned, and it should be, not celebrated in the way that it is today. Chapter 2, he goes on to talk about middleman minorities, specifically Jewish Americans, and he talks about how the middleman minorities were basically hated just for doing the work that other people didn't want to do, such as money lending, especially, and also facilitating transactions and the transaction of goods particularly. And oftentimes people on the outside would say, hey, these people are, ganging up against us and trying to make money off of us, and they're slimy or this or that. And like he says in the book, he kind of smashing all these stereotypes and stating that, Jewish Americans valued education more than many other minority groups, and they valued making money. And that's another part in which culture comes into play, because this is just part of their culture. This is something that they just did. It wasn't that they were intentionally trying to, quote unquote, take over the world. And I see that in a lot of middleman minorities across the world, just as like the Lebanese and Sierra Leone, as he mentions. And oftentimes I feel like the middleman minority are hated because they're successful, because they do the things that other people don't want to do, and they put in the work and they put in the time and they value the things that other people don't want to value to be successful. So I think that was a very interesting chapter. So chapter 3, the real history of slavery. This is the one chapter where I do not necessarily agree with him on more or less everything that he's saying. I feel like in this chapter, he talks about the real history of slavery, as in he talks about what things were like for Black Americans and white Americans back in that time. So talking about Northern whites and their behaviors or their attitudes towards Black Americans, and as well as Southern whites and their behaviors towards Black Americans as well, and vice versa. And especially the master-slave relationships and how society really viewed certain things at that time. So for example, he talks about the Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln put into effect during his presidency to effectively free all slaves. And a lot of people, there are some people that are upset with the fact that Abraham Lincoln at the time had motivation to beat the South, and the Emancipation Proclamation hurt the South in the Civil War. So a lot of attitudes today, reading the Emancipation Proclamation, are how could he not have more empathy towards slaves, and how could he not, have done this earlier, or what have you. There's a lot of, statements being made around that particular document. And I find that interesting, right? I kind of agree with that attitudes were different at that time. And, there's certain things that couldn't just fly. Even if you believe a certain thing, you would be killed for doing the wrong thing. It just wasn't accepted, no matter how much you tried for yourself. But in this chapter, I feel like he's trying to paint slave owners as kind of, at least some slave owners, as people or individuals that were just at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? And I just didn't agree with that aspect of it. These were horrible people that enslaved under other human beings. Doesn't matter if it occurred throughout the world. As he states in this chapter, he talks about how every race has been enslaved, essentially, and every race has been an enslaver. And I get that, but it doesn't matter what time in history slavery occurred, it's still a horrible, awful thing to do. And I don't think that it takes you getting out of that time to understand that, hey, maybe I shouldn't treat another human being like a dog. I can understand maybe attitudes towards different races at the time, but, treating another human being like that, I don't think that, treating another human being as property, I just don't think that is ever okay. He talks about, George Washington and the fact that, he treated his slaves well, or there was one other historical figure that he discussed who had left a majority of his wealth to one of his slaves. And even then, I asked myself, well, if they felt this way towards slavery and their slaves that they owned, then why didn't they just pay them so that they could have an opportunity to, live on their own? I just have a lot of questions in regards to this chapter in particular, as to, there are other things that they possibly could have done. But then again, I'm living in 2023. I'm not living in the 1800s, and I don't really know what it would have been like for a white person, to really stand up against racism and be extremely vocal about it, and what that would have meant for their livelihood as a result. So that being said, chapter 3 is probably one of the most controversial chapters, I would say, in this book. But I mean, I thought that it was interesting to learn about the history of slavery across the world, especially within Africa, and how that all occurred. Those are things that I really didn't know previously. Okay, moving on to chapter 4. I didn't find chapter 4 too intriguing. It was about Germany, and it's called Germans in History. And it's not something that I found extremely appealing in terms of like the whole scope of the book. He really just discusses German history and in particular the Holocaust, and again is questioning, as other people question, well, why didn't Germans do anything during that time and to end the Holocaust or be outspoken against literal Nazis? He is again trying to be more like, hey, like they didn't know that was exactly happening at the time. They didn't know the implications of putting Hitler into power. They didn't really know. And the concentration camps were really hidden, apparently, according to this book, at the time, to Germans. Again, obviously the Holocaust is just an atrocious thing to have had occurred. And, I hope that that's not something that we ever repeat in history, and he talks about ways to not have that repeat. And I thought that was insightful. Moving on to chapter 5, I thought that this was the most influential chapter for me in terms of my perspective on the book. So it was titled Black Education, Achievements, Myths, and Tragedies. So he talks about Black schools that existed before desegregation, and they excelled. They had great students, they had great faculty. These kids were performing exceptionally, these Black kids. And he talks about the stats surrounding this and the people that came out of these schools and how it functioned and how they became successful at this school, Dunbar High School, he mentions. And it's interesting that he mentions in this particular chapter how other minorities that were seen as less than back then found their way up because they were willing to accept the help from white folks that knew more. He took the example of the Japanese in assimilating and understanding and educating themselves on these topics that they didn't know, as they were behind at the time, and advancing themselves by gaining as much knowledge as they could from whoever they could. And he says how Black Americans never really did this, as they wanted to have professors or teachers that looked like them. And at the time, the most educated people were not Black people, unfortunately, just how things were, but it was a fact. So he's stating how it doesn't matter what your teacher looks like, doesn't matter what your professor looks like, it just matters that they're able to properly educate you to the best of their ability. And I could not agree more with that. And how there are a lot of excuses for Black students as to why they can't perform. And I think that was also funny because if a Black student performs badly, for example, it's due to racism and discrimination and all the isms, right? And I agree. And if you look at a white student that doesn't perform well, it's never due to racism. It's just due to the fact that, XYZ is just a different excuse. And I found that interesting. It's like, hey, like sometimes maybe it's just the kid needs to work harder, or that's what people would say for white kids. Why can't they say that for Black kids? Because if you say that they need to work harder, then you're insulting their culture. And we come back into this loop of, insulting or criticizing things that people can control rather than things that people cannot control. So you can control your ability to study, you can control your ability to work hard in life to achieve good things, but you can't control your race, for example. So great chapter on that particular topic. And then lastly, chapter 6 is called History versus Visions. And in this chapter, he discusses how history is oftentimes framed in a certain way. So history should be told as history, not with a particular agenda. So who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys in every historical story? Who knows, right? You should be able to understand both perspectives, even if you don't agree and you can see that someone is clearly the bad guy here. I think that he is right in the fact that history should be told. right? There's no point in sugarcoating it or framing it a certain way to make it seem like all white people are bad and all Black people are, you know, martyrs and oppressed and this and that. I completely and wholeheartedly agree in that statement that, you know, tell history as it is and don't try to finagle it to fit your worldview. And there were quite a few pieces in this book that I really, really loved. But in the last chapter, there were a couple phrases that or passages that I liked. He talks about in here, so he talks about, you know, history and framing history, as I mentioned in the last chapter. And he says that, you know, there was a political figure that aptly pointed out that much that is said and done today that makes no sense in itself is a result of a desperate desire of whites to avoid being considered racist and a desperate desire of Blacks to avoid being considered inferior. And I think that really sums up the the political and social and racial environment that we live in today is really structured around the fact that white liberals want to implement policies or state things or be part of movements that make them help or seem like they help the minorities. And it's really a power grab, you know, and it's also a guilt trip that they're taking for themselves in the feeling of, oh, I am so privileged and I need to help these poor Black individuals. And I feel like I talk about this a lot on my page, but it was really refreshing to be able to read that in this book. And I believe that Sowell is very educated and very he has a very good understanding of the world that we live in today, especially considering his age. I just learned that he's 92. And that's incredible considering the time that he grew up in to still have these beliefs. It's really enlightening and eye-opening to see that he is able to just reject the noise that we hear today of white people need to help everyone beneath them instead of, hey, you know, we need to fix this Black community. We need to talk about our problems. We need to solve our problems. We need to fix our problems before we ask anybody for help. And until the Black community in this country decides to do that, they will stay exactly where they're at. So that is my summary on Black, Rednecks, and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. I would highly recommend that you read this book if you haven't, or if you have, tell me the things that you agree with me on in terms of this review or disagree with me on. I would be so happy to know how you saw this book. So that's all I got for you guys. Thanks.